Hello, ladies and gentlemen, at Gwynedd Mercy University. It's good to be with you virtually right now. You might be able to tell that I'm still a little bit under the weather. I'm still a little bit stuffy and I guess a little bit tired, but I'm better than I was the other day. So, and hopefully, God willing, I'll be better by next Tuesday when we meet. But this is the lecture for our course today. And as you know, it is Hispanic Heritage Month. And during Hispanic Heritage Month, I would like to honor certain American Hispanics, Catholics who are on their way to sainthood, hopefully, maybe. And to honor them by talking about them. And today I'm going to talk about this gentleman. The picture here, he's clearly a bishop, a sacred figure, one might say. Well, he is a sacred figure, and you can kind of see how he's dressed by the symbols of what he's dressed as, that he is a sacred religious figure. He is a pointer to ultimate reality. His name is Venerable Alphonse Gallegos. Let me write this down for you so you can see it. Venerable Alphonse Gallegos. There's his name so you can see it. Okay, and you can see him here in this picture. And who was he? He's venerable, so he's the next stage. He's not a servant of God, but he's the next stage up, which is venerable. So he can be honored and prayed to by Catholics as a saint. He lived from 1931 until 1991 when he died. So he died in the early 90s. Excuse me. He was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the state of New Mexico, so he was born an American. So he's truly an American, not like Junipero Serra or some of the other people I might talk to where I got to kind of draw them into America. He's definitely an American citizen. And he was, or became a priest. Catholic. He went to the seminary and he became a deacon and a priest and ministered as a priest. And then in the early 80s, in 1981, he was made an auxiliary bishop of Sacramento. I'm presuming that's Sacramento, California. Auxiliary bishop. An auxiliary bishop is just a helper. Auxilium in Latin means to help. Okay, so a helper bishop. And there are some dioceses that are so large that they not only have the main bishop, the bishop of the diocese, but sometimes there are appointed other men to assist the main bishop who are called helper bishops, auxiliary bishops, and that's what happened with him. He was nicknamed the Bishop of the Barrios. The Bishop of the Barrios. Barrio is a Spanish word. I don't know if it's an American Spanish word, if it developed out of the American experience, or if it also comes from Spain or from South America or Central America. But anyways, a barrio is kind of like a slum in a way. It's kind of like the ghetto, we might say. I put that in italics because it's a foreign word in English. And he would go out into these Hispanic ghettos in the area that he was. Oh, that's interesting. I missed that. Okay. Just looking at my notes and I missed a little piece of information. I'll come back to it. But anyways, he would go out into the barrios, into the Hispanic ghettos, I'm presuming in Sacramento, to work as part of his ministry. And this was while he was a bishop. He did this as a priest, but he also continued this ministry later as a bishop. He would go out to the barrios and he would minister to the gang members, the people who were involved in gangs, the lowrider community, those people who like to take old cars and, they put all sorts of electronics and technology in them so that they ride low and then the wheels will make them bounce up and down and all sorts, they put all, what do you call them, pistons or whatchamacallits. The words popped into my head for a second, but you know what I'm talking about, I think. And other at-risk youth in these poor areas of Los Angeles and Sacramento. Okay, so Los Angeles as well. He moved to Los Angeles. Sacramento is up in the north of California. So eventually he moved down to the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. And, he wouldn't show up dressed like a bishop. Apparently he would dress up in a sombrero Which is, I guess in his case, it's not cultural appropriation. I mean, if I did it, there might be some questions. But he showed up in a sombrero, I guess, just to make them laugh, and a T-shirt to minister to these people. So, he was a nice guy, and he was a holy guy, and tried to bring Christ to people who were living in difficult situations, in poverty, in violence. Some people who, if they were in gangs, hopefully they were looking for something. They were looking for something, maybe God, and they found it in a gang, and he was trying to lead them away from that. He was, I also wanted to mention that it's in my notes here. Where are we here? He was a religious. He was a member of a religious order. In the 1950s, he joined the Order of Augustinian Recollects. Recollects. To be recollected means to be like you're in meditation. Okay, so this was a group of their friars. Okay, they're brothers, and they were not founded by this man Saint Augustine, but they take their way of life and their spirit of life from a man named Saint Augustine of Hippo, who died back in the 5th century A.D., the 400s. Saint Augustine really has no connection to this religious order. The religious order started like in the 1100s and 1200s, many, many centuries after Saint Augustine of Hippo was dead. He was an African saint. Hippo is in northern Africa. But they took their way of life from him, their spirit of life. And there are different Augustinian groups. There are reform groups within the first group and stuff like that. And the Recollects, I believe, were one of the reform groups. They were meant to be stricter, more into meditation and stuff like that. So he joined them. And I guess he died as one of them. I don't think he left, even after he became bishop. So anyway, that's his story. He's on his way. He's been declared venerable, which means they've definitely opened his case, and people are promoting his case to the Vatican. And so I guess what they're doing is they're waiting for a miracle to declare him blessed. But right now he's still honorable. So I honor you, Venerable Alphonse Gallegos, Bishop of Christ and of his church, and ask for your prayers for us. Amen. Okay. Over here. Now, back to work. Okay, put that down there. Put that down there. Get our PowerPoint going. Sacred writing. Okay. Where did we finish? We finished with unicity. So let's get to unicity. Da-da-da-da-da. Power, authority. Yes, there we go. Sacredness. So I don't need to beat a dead horse with sacredness. And now we are on unicity. Okay, so this is, what is this, our third or our fourth characteristic? I forget. Anyways, one of our characteristics of the functions of a sacred writing. Okay, remember before what we talked about power. The sacred writings have a power. Okay, they have some kind of exertion or a quality of authority or influence over others. Whoops. They have authority. They determine people's behavior and the way they think. They are sacred. They are pointers to ultimate reality. And now we're talking about unicity. Okay, so this is our fourth characteristic. Unicity is just another word for uniqueness. That's all it is. It's a fancy word for unique. Okay, so the sacred writings are taken as unique. Okay, they're taken out of all the writings that might belong to a community, and the community says, no, these are special beyond all others. They're unique. And so unicity is that state or quality of being the one and only of its kind. Okay, that's the one and only of its kind. It's unique. From the Latin unicus, from which we get the word unique through French. Unicus, which means exactly that. Only one of its kind, single, comes from the Latin word unus, which means one. Okay, so it's the only one of its kind. So as per our reading from William Graham in the Encyclopedia of Religion, he writes that no matter what the origins or the development of the parts of a scriptural corpus, of a body of writings, a body of scriptures. So it doesn't matter where they came from or how they developed or how diverse are the parts of a body of sacred writings. And they can be very diverse. There can be many different genres, even within one scripture, like the Bible. It's commonly conceived as a unified whole. It's one. It's unique. It has a unique status. All those writings of different genres or whatever are conceived as being one sacred revelation, one sacred word, and so they have an internal consistency and authoritativeness as truth. They're all telling the same truth, which maybe is not the best way to look at it, because especially when we start reading the Bible, if you haven't started reading the Bible already for this course, we have had some readings from the Bible, but maybe you have started perusing through your Bibles, because the writings are different. That they're getting at truth in different ways. Historical writings are not telling us truth in the same way that poetic writings are, nor do they intend to. That's not their intention. Someone writing a story is not trying to get at the truth in the same way that someone who is writing, say, a more philosophical type work. Okay, the truth is the same. I mean, their object is the same. They're looking for truth, but they're not looking for it in the same way. And so, their methods are different. And the way they express the truth probably will also be different. So remember that when we talk later about interpreting Scripture and looking for truth in the sacred Scriptures. But to say that the Scripture or a sacred writing is unique, that it has unicity, means that there's nothing like it. Okay? It is a writing. So it's relative in that sense. It's relative to other human writings or other writings, but there is something about this writing, because it is such a pointer to ultimate reality, that there's nothing else like it. And so the idea of unicity or uniqueness is linked to a belief in a suprahuman or superhuman origin to the words of the Scriptures, to what's been written down. It comes from humans, maybe, but definitely more than humans in a lot of cases. There's a supernatural origin, which makes it unique in that way. Okay. The next function of Scripture is this idea of inspiration, and I'll talk more about inspiration in another class. In fact, I'll talk about revelation and inspiration, but Graham brings up the idea of inspiration, so I'll give you a definition of it as another function. And I guess this ties into the uniqueness of the sacred writing, because it's unique because it comes from a supernatural source. Its motivation is from a supernatural source, which makes it unique. So its inspiration it is inspired by a supernatural source. And what does inspiration mean? It's having your mind and your will, your ability to choose, moved or influenced to do something. So another way to talk about inspiration would maybe be to use the word influence or motivation, if those are more helpful words for you. Inspiration is just a more religious or theological term. And it comes from the Latin word inspiro, which means to breathe into something. That's what spiritus means. Spirit in Latin simply means the movement of air, which can mean breath or wind. Okay. It can also mean to stimulate or to motivate in a more abstract way, to influence or motivate someone. So inspiration, have your mind and your will moved by something to do something. Could be anything. Could be writing a book, like the inspired books of the Bible. You could be inspired to go out to a foreign country, to be a missionary, to convert others to the message of Christ. You could be inspired to become a doctor, a physician, or a sports broadcaster or something. You're all motivated. It's inspiration. It doesn't necessarily have to have a supernatural or religious connotation to it, but in this case it does. It has a religious meaning. The belief is that there's something, ultimate reality interacts with a person in such a way that it motivates that person to reveal something about, or to, I should say, communicate what has been revealed about that ultimate reality to that person. So, inspiration, let me just see. Okay, no. I'm still talking about inspiration. Inspiration could refer to actual speech that's motivated. Someone has to go out. They don't write anything, but they're motivated or inspired to proclaim a message from a god. And in that case, we call these people prophets. They're just proclaimers. They're speaking. It's orally transmitted to their listeners, the message of the god, a prophet. And they're inspired. They're considered to be inspired. Maybe sometimes their prophecies will get written down. Okay, and that we find that in the Bible. In fact, there's a whole large section of the Bible, of the Old Testament, which is called the prophets, the prophetical literature. Inspiration can also be derived from having something revealed directly to someone. Not a seer in a way. Like prophets are more like seers. They have visions maybe. But you can have a more direct experience of revelation. And you find this, for example, in Islam. The Quran was directly revealed to Muhammad. He actually saw the words. You could say it was a vision, I guess. But, Muslims believe that he actually saw the words that were written on the stone tablet that's in heaven, where the whole Quran is written down. And he would see portions of that text in classical Arabic, by the way, written by God, not by any human person. It was written directly by God. So he would see them, and then he would recite them. He didn't write anything down, apparently. Others wrote down what he recited later, but he was just reciting. It was what was directly revealed to him from the inscription written by God. We have this kind of same idea. For example, we find this kind of same idea in the Bible. If I go to, just one second here, go to my to my notes in the book of Exodus. What I have here, chapter 31, verse 18, and we'll look it up here. I got this is my internet, and I'll go to right here. I got it bookmarked. The neighbor, my Bible right here. The book of Exodus. What did I say? Chapter 18. Oh no, did I say chapter 31? Sorry, that's how bad my memory is. Yeah, it's 31. Verse 18. Okay, here we go. Okay. Blah 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 blah. Yeah. Okay. So it's Moses and God talking, or more like God talking. It's more God talking to Moses, giving Moses all sorts of instructions, and he gives him. Here we have all sorts of instructions about the Sabbath, Saturday for the Jews, and what Israelites should do and should not do on those days. And at the very end of it, in verse 18, it says, when the Lord had finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the covenant, the stone tablets inscribed by God's own finger. Okay, he's talking about the 10 Commandments, really, not talking about the whole law. Although there is Jewish tradition that believes that God actually inscribed the whole law on these 2 tablets, not just the 10 Commandments themselves. Okay, that's fine. I wasn't there. But notice how the author of this text describes it. He describes these 2 stone tablets of the covenant, the agreement between God and the Jews. He describes them, but the information he reveals is that these tablets were written down. They were inscribed by God with his finger. So like God with one of his fingers just kind of wrote down, like you're writing on a tablet or something, he just wrote, a modern tablet, you know what I'm saying? I don't even know if people use tablets anymore. They were the big thing, like 10, 20 years ago. Microsoft had a tablet and everyone had a tablet, but now you have your cell phone. But anyways, moving his finger. Now, I'm a Christian, and I believe in the God of the Jews, who does not have a body, so he doesn't have fingers. So I'm assuming that this is just a metaphorical description by the author. But the idea is that it directly comes from God. He, in fact, so direct that God actually wrote the words down for Moses on the stone. Whoops, what happened there? There we go. Ah! Okay. Sorry. How else can inspiration occur? Well, it can also be an experience. It can be not a vision like a prophet or some kind of direct revelation like for Islam, but it can be an experience of transcending the natural world where you kind of you have a transcendent experience of ultimate reality. You kind of see heaven in a way, or you see the world. Maybe some people might describe this as a feeling of being one or united with the whole universe. It's a transcendent experience. And religious studies, I forget who came up with this term. I'd have to look it up. It's Abraham Maslow, but anyways, called these peak experiences. You reach a peak, a transcendent moment. We find this kind of idea in Buddhism. The Buddha was not inspired necessarily by a god. In fact, the god, according to the stories amongst the Buddhists, the gods came to the Buddha to learn about ultimate reality and bowed down before Buddha. That's how great the Buddha was. But anyways, he really just transcended the natural world. He entered into nirvana by just simply being inspired. He touched ultimate reality and realized what it was. And that changed him. He entered nirvana, okay, which is simply nirvana is the state of, full realization of what ultimate reality is, which is empty. Emptiness. Sometimes people say nothingness, but it's not really nothing. It's just empty. Empty of action, empty of thought. The place where all opposites come into contact and kind of like matter and antimatter just annihilate each other. Okay. So that's another way of being inspired. The Buddha was inspired by just simply by experiencing ultimate reality. So the bringer of the sacred word, the one who's inspired, is considered a mediator, a go-between, a medium. Medium means in the middle from Latin. So someone who is a go-between or a middleman, you might say, between the transcendent and worldly existence. So that's kind of like what the Buddha became. He became like a mediator between the transcendent, which he realized he was awakened to, and worldly existence. And so he spent the rest of his life going around northern India preaching what he had experienced and leading other people into it. The scriptures the people who write down or had their visions, the prophets and other people like in the Bible, they're mediators as well. And the people who wrote down their experiences are mediators as well. They're mediating what they've been inspired by. They're motivated to write down what they've experienced of ultimate reality. Let's see, do I want to say anything about that? No, I guess I'll move on. The last aspect that Graham talks about that makes the sacred writings special or helps them to function is their antiquity, their age. Which, is not, it's maybe not the best selling point because you can have other writings that are very, very old and yet they're not inspired or they're not considered unique or whatever. But it certainly is a hallmark, or it's usually a plus if you can say that your sacred writings go all the way back to the beginning or just very, very old. It's not often that someone comes before you and said, "Oh yeah, we have this new scripture, this new sacred book. It was written 10 years ago." Oh, okay. It's like that's not much of a lineage, 10 years ago. Usually you want antiquity to sacred writings. Antiquus means old in Latin. It's where ancient. It's where we get our word antique from. And it's based on the preposition ante, which means before. So antiquus means that which has come before something else. Okay, which makes sense. Something is an antique, it's old. Obviously, it's come before something that's not old, okay, or new. I am old. Most of my students are not old. In relation to me, because you're in your 20s. or maybe in your late teens, some of you, but I'm assuming that most of you are in your 20s or early 20s. I'm going on 52, so I'm like 30 years ahead of you. So I've got 30 more years on you. Ante, 30 more years before you. So I have come before. I was before you were born. All right, I was in existence before you were born. When you weren't even a thought in anybody's mind. No one was expecting you. Either metaphorically or, in the case of your mothers, literally. You know? And you are antiquus. You have an antiquity factor in relation to, people who are younger than you, children, a 10-year-old. You have 10 more years, if you're in your 20s, on that kid. You came before that child. So, it's all on how you look at things. But usually antiquity has to do with really something that's come before, a long time before. It's old. So oftentimes scriptures or sacred writings are very, very old. For example, in the case of the Bible, they're just, they're very, very old. When they started writing the Bible down, we have, guesses, educated guesses about when that happened. And that's, a long time ago. It's maybe 2,500 years ago is when we started getting actual texts of scripture of the Bible written down. There may have been texts before that. In the case of, say, other religions like Hinduism, it's even older, probably 3,500 years ago in the case of Hinduism. In the case of Islam, not 1,400 years, basically, because of when Muhammad lived. He lived in the 7th century A.D., so it's not as long, but it's, 1,400 years is still a long time. And there might be some things that go to the beginning of the world, So, for example, in Hinduism, for example, the belief is that their sacred writings, their sacred scriptures, that are true sacred scriptures, even though they've been written down, are the divine. As I said, they're the sound of the universe. So they come from the very origins. They're primordial. Prime means first. Order, they're of the first order. They're primordial. They're from the beginnings of the universe. The Vedas are part of the universe. That's why they're divine. They're part of the divine constitution of the universe, the ultimate reality. So they don't even really have an age in a way. They're timeless, literally timeless, because their origin is supernatural. So antiquity, sometimes in some religions, antiquity is even not just very, very old, but, even beyond time, as in the case of the Vedas of Hinduism. And in getting back to Hinduism, when they talk about their mythology, the word that they use for myth, which is Purana, it is translated sometimes as myth. But actually, this is a Sanskrit word. I mentioned Sanskrit before. It's an ancient language, dead language. It's related to Latin and Greek. But anyways, Purana means stories. It's usually translated as myth, or oftentimes you'll see people translate this word Purana as myth, and it is. It's it contains there are many, many Puranas in Hinduism, and they are myths. They're telling stories about the gods and supernatural stuff. But literally, the word Purana simply means old or ancient. So really, they're stories about ancient times. So that makes them sacred, because they're revealing ancient times. Which is I guess an interesting question. Why does it have to be about ancient times? What is it about revealing things from the past, and usually the far past, that interests people? And is a good indicator of ultimate reality, I guess, because people want to know their origins. They want to know where things have come from. Okay, and so we have, there we go. We want to know what came ultimately before. I think I already mentioned that. So, a lot of times these sacred writings are seen to be eternal, and I mentioned that with Hinduism. They exist without any limitation in space or time. The Latin word aeternus comes from the word avum, and an avum in Latin is an age, a long period of uninterrupted, never-ending time. If it's never-ending, then yeah, it's really long. It's an age. So, it's a really, really long time. It's just never-ending time, basically. So that's what eternal means. That God is eternal because he's beyond space and time. He has no limit of space or time. And sometimes the sacred writings have that as well, as I mentioned with Hinduism. The sacred writings of Hinduism, which I mentioned, it's not a world religions class, so I haven't gotten deeply into this kind of stuff. I've been kind of trying to avoid it because I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but I guess I have to mention it, are the Vedas and the Upanishads are the two basic, Darn it. I hate you, Microsoft. Changes the formatting and everything. You couldn't just work. Can't just work with Microsoft. Anyways, the Vedas and all sorts of things that are combined with the Vedas, because there are commentaries on the Vedas and stuff like that I'm not mentioning, but there are these 4 collections of writing called the Vedas that contain knowledge basically of how to perform the sacrifices in Hinduism, the sacrifices to the gods. But then there's this other work called the Upanishads, which again is, which I mentioned before, the Upanishads sitting down nearby, the guru, okay? And the Upanishads are a series of lectures by a guru to his students about the nature of ultimate reality. And, to make a long story short, the upshot of those lectures is that basically ultimate reality, since we come out of ultimate reality and everything comes out of ultimate reality, therefore everything is really one with ultimate reality. So whatever the ultimate reality of the universe, which is divine, is you, and you are it. So you are in some sense divine and a god. Well, I shouldn't say even some sense. You are in the real sense divine and a god. And so everything that you do in Hinduism, like yoga and meditation, are all meant to open up your mind to that realization that you really are a god. You really are God, ultimately. You are the divine source of the universe, because that's where you came from. So the Vedas and the Upanishads come from the divine source of the universe. So they are divine, truly divine. Not just because they were written by a god, because they weren't. They weren't written at all. They are the sound of the universe. The Vedas emerge out of this divine, godlike ultimate reality from which everything else emerges. The cosmos, the gods, the planets, animals, people. Okay? So the Vedas are part of the structure, and the Upanishads as well. Anything that is the sound of the universe, recognized as the sound of the universe, is eternal. It has no limitation in space or time. Yeah. Okay? That's kind of different from the Bible, as we'll see, because that's not really what the church teaches about the Bible. The Bible is not eternal. The Word of God is eternal. God's revelation is eternal because it comes from God and He's eternal. But the written scriptures are not the source of the universe, or they're not part of the source of the universe. Okay, so we need to, there's a distinction there between what is coming from God and not making even the Bible into a god, because that would make it into an idol, and there's only one God. The Bible is not God. Okay, even though it is a sacred book. In some religions, the scripture is God. As in the case of Hinduism, the Vedas and the Upanishads are divine by nature. That's why they're unchangeable and everything. You can't really do critical study of the Vedas. I mean, you can, scholars do, but in the religion, you really can't, because you're dealing with something that's just simply beyond human knowledge. In Sikhism as well, you have the same kind of idea, but it's to their holy book, in Sikhism, which I've kind of mentioned before, that the book is the guru, the book is the master, and the book is kind of like a person, and you worship it. as God in a way. It's eternal. It doesn't change. It's not the same thing with Christians in the Bible, though, or at least with the Catholic Church in the Bible. The Bible there is a human element to it. Humans participate with God in the creation of their sacred writing. Okay, so there's a difference there that I guess maybe I'll talk about later. Well, I will want to talk about it later. But let's move on to encounter. We're done with what is a sacred writing. Anyways, here we are. Let's move on to what is an encounter. What is an encounter? Huh, that's weird. Hold on one second. Okay. Well, I put something as the background in my... hold on one second. I just want to put it here. There we go. Don't know why it didn't take. Anyways. What is an encounter? All right, what does it mean? So we've talked about what is writing, what is the sacred, what is a sacred writing. Okay, now we're going to talk about what does it mean to encounter a sacred writing. What does this mean? And the picture I've chosen for this slide is a picture by Matthias Stom, of Jesus revealing himself after his resurrection at a meal with some of his followers. That's an encounter. They encountered Jesus, as the Gospel of Luke tells us. It's only in the Gospel of Luke he tells us this story. He's the only one who tells us the story. They encountered Jesus in the breaking of the bread. When Jesus broke the bread, they recognized in this act of worship Jesus, the presence of Jesus. So there's a tie-in with the Eucharist there in the Mass, that Jesus is present in the breaking of the bread. And when once they recognize Jesus, they have this encounter with him, Jesus disappears. Why, I don't know. Why he didn't stick around, I don't know. But he disappears. Okay, so what is an encounter? Let's get on to that. Let's go back for a moment to our friend Aristotle and remember the definition that Aristotle gave of what writing was in his book, De Interpretatione. Well, part of his book, a book that he was writing on logic and rhetoric, and part of that's called the De Interpretatione, on interpretation. And he talks a little bit about writing, and he says basically writing is written speech. We have thoughts in our heads. He calls them passions, emotions. I'll call them thoughts. Okay, but anyways, which are motivators, by the way. So it's inspired because passions and emotions motivate us, don't they? So we have thoughts, we have emotions, we have passions, and we talk about them. These lead to us saying things. We try to describe them by talking to people, because they're not in our minds, they're not in our brains. They can't see. They don't have access. They don't have access to what our thoughts are. Unless, of course, they're telepaths. But if they are, then you have to make them join Psy-Corps. So they don't invade people's privacy, you know? Any Babylon 5 fans out there? I don't know. Anyways. But you can't see into their minds and into another person's mind and into another person's thoughts, generally. Okay? So we have to communicate them to others. I have to tell you what I'm thinking. Hopefully I'm telling you what I'm thinking accurately. That's interesting. Am I communicating accurately what I'm thinking? But another way of communicating speech that develops amongst human beings is the practice of writing things down, using characters and symbols to represent the sounds that I'm making to you right now. Okay, and so we have writing, the act of writing down what I'm speaking. Okay, use different characters to write down these sounds, and that's what leads to text. Then we have text. We have a written or printed word. We have a written or printed product. which has been written. And so we call it a text. It's a text. We can also say writing. They're kind of synonymous. But I think there is a distinction between, a writing and a text. Okay, or the act of writing and the production of a text. You could also say production of a writing. So they are kind of synonymous, but maybe there is a distinction to be had. Anyways, what's my point? My point is that the text, or what's written down, ultimately goes back to the mouth, which speaks, okay, and ultimately, again, to the mind, which thinks, which created the speech in the first place through its thoughts, and which formed the speech, which willed the oral function, you might say, of our body, our jaw and tongue and teeth, and to all start forming sounds that make sense to somebody else, okay? That's an act of the will. We have to choose to say something. For the most part. I mean, obviously, there might be people of mental disabilities where they have to keep speaking or whatever. So whatever. But normally, you have to actively choose to speak, to express what's in your mind. So what we're doing is, this is all leading back to the fact that it all comes from a person in some way. Okay? It comes from people. Even a writing, even, reading a book, a text, okay? Even if the person didn't speak the text into the computer, like it was, speech-to-text software, they didn't use that, but they were just thinking and writing out on their computer or writing it out on a piece of paper. Still, it ultimately comes back to a mind which is possessed by a person. And hence this picture of people, human beings. You're dealing with human beings. All sorts of different human beings, different sexes, different races, different ethnicities. Okay? And so we have this comment from one of our readings, or part of our reading, from Adler, Kastner, and Wardle. Hopefully you read it. Just a selection. And this is from Kevin Rusin. Or it could be Rosen, but I'm going to assume it's pronounced Rusin. Again, I don't know. I don't know his mind. If I don't have him here to tell me, what's the correct pronunciation of his name, of his last name. All I have is the text. But I now know something about the author of the text. I know his actual name. There is a human being with a name. And I know he's a human being because he has a name. So I know a couple things about him. And I know he's a him, most likely, because Kevin is usually a male assigned name. So now I know 3 things, actually. I've extrapolated 3 things, just from the writing, just from the text. Okay? Because you're always dealing with a person, with a text, with a mind that wrote it. An encounter. It's an encounter. Writing is a social and a rhetorical activity, okay? In his brief article for the book, he says this: writing puts the writer in contact with other people, even if you're writing all alone. Because anyone who reads what you wrote, eventually, you make a contact with that person. Indirectly, true, but there's a contact made. But Rusin thinks that the social nature of writing goes beyond the people writers draw upon and think about. It also encompasses the countless number of people who have shaped the genres, the tools, the artifacts, the technologies, and the places writers act with as they address the needs of their audiences. So basically what he's trying to say is it's not just a writer-reader relationship, okay, or author-audience. Because how the person chooses to write his or her story, the genre, okay? Or even how the person chooses to write, meaning the form of communication, whether the person writes a book, writes an ebook, writes a blog, okay? These all come from other people. I mean, people have someone along the way invented the genre of the mystery story, or the science fiction book, or the novel, or the poem. Someone had to have invented it. Someone came up with it. Okay, even though we don't know in a lot of cases who did that. because it's just lost to us in history, okay? But someone did, not me. So I'm already in a relationship with that anonymous someone who did that. Someone created computers. I don't know who. Okay, I'm sure I can go on Wikipedia and find out who is believed to have created the first true computer from which we get modern computers. Okay, but the computer I'm using right now, my laptop that I bring to class, I mean, that was created by other people, from the people who designed the software to the hardware to the people who put it together in the manufacturing company or place. Okay, other persons are involved. So everything the writer is using, you're never doing it truly alone. Other people are there who've helped you, even if it's just simply the technology you're using. So it's a broader, it is a social activity with a writer. It's not as singular as you might think and alone. All of these available means of persuasion that we take up when we write have been shaped by and through the use of many others who've left their traces on and inform our uses of those tools, even if we're not aware of it. You know, I grew up, of course, when I first learned to write, I was writing with a pencil or a pen on a piece of paper. Okay. Later on in my life, you know, I liked writing and I wanted to write books and all sorts of stuff. And I wanted a typewriter. I just thought that was the coolest thing. And I wanted an electric typewriter. And as soon as I could, you know, I got a typewriter. And eventually, and that's all I wanted one Christmas. And my mom didn't buy one for me. It's the worst Christmas ever for me. Because I told her that's the only thing I want for Christmas. Nothing else. But she just didn't have the money for it. But eventually I did get an electric typewriter. And man, I pounded away on that thing and broke it. I mean, I used that thing. And I had other typewriters along the way. But you know what? Once it got into the 90s, I had computers. You know, I got a computer, and that's what I used. I didn't type out typewriters anymore. I didn't use a typewriter anymore. I put that away. And I wouldn't use a typewriter now. Why? Well, for the obvious reason, it's too slow. It's just too slow. The whole process of writing using a typewriter is just too slow. If I I type something and then I read it and I make all sorts of corrections, I've got to type it all over again. Unlike on a word processor, I can make corrections on the fly and stuff like that. And it's much easier to make a mass of corrections. You can just replace stuff using, the macro to replace stuff throughout your document. And so it's a lot easier. I would never go back to it, even though I loved it. And I loved, and there's a part of me that still, the clickety click of the keys and the way that, the ink looks like on the paper. It's just, it's like people who love LPs, that don't want to use CDs or MP3s anymore. There's a movement for people to go back and buy actual records and you have record players because they say it sounds better. I honestly don't think so, but whatever, because I grew up with record players and I ain't going back for my MP3s. Sorry about that. But I would not. But the point is that the way I wrote and the way I write now has been shaped by other people. As they made further inventions, people invented a typewriter. And so instead of handwriting my stories or letters or whatever, I was typing them out. And I thought that was the coolest thing. But eventually, I got a word processor in the 90s, and then I got a computer. And so, the technologies have changed the way I write. Okay, I'm not writing the same way that I wrote on a typewriter. Okay. I don't have to worry about making mistakes, and at least used to have this white tape that would be if you had a correctable typewriter, a correctable thing. If you didn't, then you were just screwed. You'd have to type the whole page over, either accept the one little mistake on the page, or just type the whole darn page over again, the whole darn page, even if it was just one mistake. But, if you had correctable tape, you had the ink on the top, the ink ribbon, and then you had a ribbon of white stuff. And, you could use that and it would copy over it, when we remove it, but it would you press the letter, and the letter would, strike the white tape and would put white over it, like white out over the letter. Then you could type over it. Okay, fine. But I'm not going back to that. Okay, the technology has changed the way I write, the way I look at writing. I don't want to go back to that kind of writing anymore. So we say I am writing an email. Well, actually, we don't, unless you're the King of England. I think only he uses the royal we there, Mr. Rusin. But anyways, we say I'm writing an email or I'm writing a note suggesting that we're composing alone and with complete autonomy. Okay? When in fact, writing can never be anything but a social and a rhetorical act. Why he adds rhetorical. Rhetorical, I think, means in the sense of, has a sense of orality, like speaking. A rhetor in Greek would be someone who is a speaker. And that's what rhetoric is. It's public speaking. So I'm not sure I would combine that. It might be, it's a little confusing to me here, but certainly I would agree it's a social activity. Writing is not really a speaking activity, I would say, but it connects us to other people across time and space in an attempt to respond adequately to the needs of an audience. So it's making a connection, an encounter, which is what I'm working up towards, the idea of encounter. That even, whatever you're writing, you're never really writing alone. Okay? If you're writing an email to me because you have a concern with the course, you're addressing it to me. You're already, just in the very act of sending an email to me, it's a social activity. It's between two persons. Okay, you're writing me, hopefully in a way I can understand about what your problem is or your question is, so that you're hoping that I can respond to you, or at least have knowledge of something. Like if you just want to tell me, oh, Dr. Dunn, I was absent from class because my car broke down, you don't need to reply to this email. I just wanted to let you know. Okay, I might reply to it. Probably I should, according to the syllabus. I should reply to your email within 2 business days. Yeah, I mean, even if you say I don't need a response, okay, you want me to have the knowledge. So there's still relationship there. You want to give me knowledge. Knowledge that I didn't have before. Okay, so there's an encounter between us, even in the email. So we're dealing with persons here. Even with a text, we are dealing with persons, relationships. And a person, I have difficulty defining this term. I mean, I know I've studied philosophy in the past. Actually, I have a degree in philosophy. My baccalaureate's in philosophy, even though I didn't continue on into graduate school in philosophy. And theology involves a lot of philosophy as well. But I'm not a philosopher. I'm not an expert in philosophy, but I know it. And I know how, some ancient or medieval philosophers, I should say, not ancient, would define a person. And this is my definition of a person. And I don't think it's perfect. It needs some polishing. Maybe I'll run it by Dr. Pat Messina, who is a philosopher in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, and see what he thinks. But I think this is a pretty good definition of a person. What is a person? Actually, it might be even a better definition, but anyways, I'll mention it later maybe. A person it's a word that we use to describe any living thing. That's number one, because I think to be a person, you have to be alive. I think that's an essential part of being a person. You can exist, but not be alive. So I didn't want to say anything that exists, because a stone exists, but it's not alive. We don't call it animate. We don't say it's alive. So a living thing that exists, how does it exist? It exists completely of itself as an individual, and it has a rational or reasoning ability, has the ability to reason. So there are, I guess, 3 parts to that definition that I need to point out. The word person comes from the Latin word persona, which we also have in English. We talk about a person's persona. I have a great persona, or someone has a personality, hey, she's got a great personality, or he's got a great personality. Well, okay. When you tell someone when you want them to go out on a blind date, that's all I'm going to say about that one. You could read between the lines. And a persona simply was a mask. It was a mask. A persona was a mask that was used by actors in the ancient world. They didn't put on makeup, generally. They had masks. And they would put masks over their faces that they would hold and they would speak through. And that was their persona, okay? So, the mask of the Zeus, the god, or the mask of Perseus, a great hero. And so they're in that persona of the hero or the god and speaking on their behalf through the mask. And it came into English or philosophical language as persona or as person for something that what we speak through. Okay, what the masks we wear. It's probably maybe not the best word to define us, because we're not masks in a way. Okay, this is not my mask, although you could say in a way it is my flesh and blood mask. But it doesn't necessarily define completely who I am, because I have a soul. Or you could say I have a personality if you don't believe in a soul. But there's something more than just tissue that's going on here that you're relating to. So I'm a person. I'm a person. I'm a living thing. I exist. I exist as myself. And I have a rational ability. I can reason. And I'm demonstrating this. I mean, you can see me as alive. Actually, I could be dead. I could be dead now. You never know. I mean, I'm doing this. This is live while I'm doing it. But, I could have recorded this earlier and could have had a heart attack afterwards. But no, this is live right now. Okay. It's going on as I'm talking. So I am alive. You can see that. I'm existing of myself. I'm an individual. Okay. I'm separate, you could say, which is, again, a dodgy word to use here for a person, because yes, as a human person, I'm separate, but God is also personal, but he's not separate or individual in that way, because there are three persons in God and they're not separate from each other. But I exist completely as myself, and I'm reasonable, I'm rational, which you can, I think, tell from the language I'm using. What I'm saying to you makes sense. If I weren't rational, it wouldn't make sense. That's one of the hallmarks of an irrational person, like a schizophrenic. A schizophrenic might be speaking English to you, but one of the identifiers for schizophrenia is the idea of, or the symptom of loose associations, where the person is speaking, but the words don't make any sense. They have no rational meaning. Okay, even though the words individually might mean something. The words I'm giving you seem to mean something, so you can presume that I'm rational as well. So I'm a person. Okay? I have the use of reason. I exist as what I am, a human. I have a nature. And I exist. I actually am, apparently. And I'm an individual. I exist as a whole. I'm a whole. Right? So texts are personal. They create an encounter, because through texts, we are actually meeting someone. We are meeting a person. We are meeting the mind that created the text, the mind which resides in a person. In other words, we're meeting the author. Okay? Even if the author is mostly unknown to us. I've never met Kevin Ruzin. I probably will never in my life meet Kevin Ruzin. But I know him now. I know something about him. I've met him in a way, indirectly, as the author of the words that we just read on the PowerPoint slide. And those words have come through me, because I put them on the PowerPoint slide. So you kind of have met him indirectly, indirectly in an indirect way. Because, I copied and pasted his words onto the slide, or into the slide, from the reading. His words that he wrote in a file were printed into a book. So, again, his original words that he wrote down, say into a Word document that he then emailed to the publisher. The publisher puts it into print in a book. I copied and I OCR'd the file, the PDF file with the words, and I copied them into my own Word document, and then I copied and pasted them into a PowerPoint slide. I mean, there's a lot of indirectness going on here from the original source. So how do you know? How is it trustworthy? Which is the original text from Kevin Reuven? I'm just throwing that out there. That's something to think about, because we'll talk about that later when we talk about revelation and inspiration, and theologians can tie themselves into knots like a pretzel trying to figure out, well, what's really the inspired scripture? What should we really consider as inspired by God in the Bible? Is it the original autograph, the original thing that was written by the inspired author? Well, yeah, but we know that things have been edited. Things have been added to. Are those inspired? Were those editors and additional authors inspired too? It can drive you crazy. Well, I've just kind of driven you crazy by talking about our encounter with Kevin Reuven and the text that I used on the PowerPoint slide. To us, we don't think about, we just kind of, almost in a way, we kind of go down the wormhole to the original text, without realizing all the stages and all the space in between the original text, which was written down whenever by Kevin Reuven, then submitted to the publisher. And we don't know what the publisher did with it, but we certainly know the publisher printed it in a book. But then this book was turned into a file, which you've read, you've looked at, a file which I used, technology, OCR, ocular something, I forget what it means, but you know what I mean. It basically can turn an image into text so that I could use it, I could copy it and put it into the PowerPoint. So you've met, there's a meeting, there's an encounter there, even still, even though it's very indirect, I would say. What does it mean to meet? It means to come into the presence of another person. So a meeting is personal. Okay? We are meeting someone through text, the person of the author. Any text, but especially in this course, a sacred text. We're meeting the author. You can see the word meet there. It comes from Old English, metan, which means to find. And that's what encounter means in a lot of... when you encounter something, you find something. It's synonymous. And in some languages, that's exactly what it means. For example, Spanish, encontrar, means to find. Encounter comes from the same Latin word, encounter. So to find something, or to come together in the same place. A gemot, a meeting or an assembly, a meeting. Okay? So we meet somebody. And what happens in sacred scripture, to bring us to our course in sacred text, and specifically the Bible, and this was in your reading from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, in the Catechism number 101. Okay, so CCC number or paragraph 101, it says, what happens in Scripture, in the sacred writings, is that God comes to meet man. In the sacred writings, in the Bible, two persons come to meet, because that's what a meeting is. You come into the presence of God. You come into the presence of God. The person who is reading and the author, ultimately the inspirer, the motivator, the originator, who is God. You're also coming into a meeting or an encounter with the people who actually wrote, the human beings who wrote, who we don't know, but you're encountering them as well. And this encounter, that the Catechism describes this encounter as a condescension, a descending, a coming down by God. God comes to meet human beings according to their abilities. In other words, through words. Okay. Could God speak to everybody and that's how he could encounter us? Sure. He's God. He could simply dump a revelation or a vision into everyone's mind. But that's apparently not how he wanted to do it. He wants something more permanent and maybe clearer than a vision, because visions can fade away. We don't necessarily have good memories, whereas there's a permanency to writing and a stability to writing. But, whatever. I don't know. God doesn't, I don't have any revelation from God or any teaching from his church or his son's church about why God had to write. But he does this. He does it through words, which is a human technology. God didn't create writing. Human beings did. And so God uses this tool to communicate to us. But it's not a meeting between equals. And maybe you might think you know where I'm going to go with this, but actually, maybe you don't, because it's not a meeting between equals, because it is God who descends to us, God who bows down to us in the sacred writings, because God lowers himself, humbles himself to use writing so that we will understand him, in order for him to lift us, lift the reader, the human, up to himself. It kind of tells you something about who God is. Tells you something about what kind of God he is in the Judeo-Christian tradition. That he's a humble God, a meek God, a loving God who will, it's not beneath him to use writing, a simple thing, for him to come down to us to lift us up. Think about other religions I've described, like Hinduism, the Vedas and the Upanishads. They don't come down to us. Okay? They're divine. You come up to them. You learn their language. Okay? And even in the written form of the Vedas don't change for you. The Vedas aren't written by human beings, even though they are. I mean, obviously they had to be, someone had to write them down. But technically they're not. They're not written by human beings. They're simply dumped into the mind of the seer who has some kind of vision, or not, I shouldn't say a vision in that way, but, as I said, hears the sound of the universe and it's all just there. Perfect. But technically there is no actual author of the Vedas. They simply have been and are. So they don't come down to you to meet you. You have to meet the Vedas. You have to be, so only certain people can read the Vedas. It used to be. I mean, times have changed, but it used to be only the priests, the highest caste in Hinduism, the social caste could read and study the Vedas, and they were all men. So only men. Women were never allowed to read the Vedas or learn them because they weren't men. If they wanted to, they had to be reincarnated in another life as a man. Okay? And even certain men couldn't read the Vedas. Like if you're of the lower caste, the very low caste, social classes, you were not allowed to read the Vedas or touch them or anything. That's not the case with God's revelation. It's for everybody. God comes for everybody. He wants everyone to know his message. Scholars talk about what's called the hermeneutical or the rhetorical triangle. Also, sometimes it's called the hermeneutical circle, even though it's more like a triangle, so I'll call it that. And hermeneutic just means interpretation. We'll learn that later when we talk about hermeneutics more in depth. But, they identify three things. And this is not the best picture. I would actually have done this picture a little bit differently, I think. But you start down at the lower left with ethos. You go up to the top with logos, and then you go down to the bottom with pathos. Ethos, this is from rhetorical criticism, people who study texts and how they interact with the audience and how they interact with the meaning. And the ethos is another word for the author or the writer. That's the ethos, the norm. Ethos in Greek means a norm or a standard, like from where we get our word ethics. Okay, so the author is the norm. That's the standard, because the author sets the writing, right? Sets the text. is the creator or the originator. And then you have the word, logos. Logos means a word, literally in Greek, but it has a lot more other meanings. It can mean reason, to study something. It can mean a whole bunch of things, but its basic meaning is a word, a logos. So the text, we have the text. And then finally we have the pathos. And pathos has the connection to feeling or emotion in Greek. So you're dealing with the audience here, the person who is made to feel by the text or enter emotionally into the text of the author. Okay, so this is the triangle or a circle, however you want to look at it, boom, 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 from point to point to point, or as a circle going around and round, of ethos to logos to pathos, back to ethos, okay, over and over again, the hermeneutical triangle of interpreting, because, through reading the text, it tells you something about the author. And then the reader brings something to the text from his or her own experience. And interprets the text, tries to know something about the author, and maybe is accurate or maybe isn't accurate. But the author, the person just has the words of the text. So so there's a dual thing going on here. You have just both the text itself and what it actually means, but then, you have to look behind it, or you try to look behind it to the intention of the author. Why did the author put these words together? Why did the author create this text? And that tells you something about the intention, the will, the choice of the author, about the author's personality. Okay? So there are things going on here. Again, the author might write for an audience. Sometimes people will talk about an author has to know his or her audience, okay? What they want to read, okay? If they're reading a mystery book, then they want the mystery, they want the murder, or murderers, usually, and the clues, and they want all that stuff. They don't want long dialogues or philosophizing or dreary, scenes or something like that, preaching or whatever. You just don't want it. Just give me a mystery. All right. You got to know your audience, what your audience wants. So the author even has to know the audience, even though the author may not know who the audience is. But you know the author through the text already. So you have this triangle. Some scholars, rhetorical critics, would add a fourth layer to this and make it into, I guess, a hermeneutical square. They would add a fourth thing, or a fourth aspect to it, which would be context, or kairos, what they call it in Greek. Text. And the word kairos means time, but it means more like a season of time, a period of time. When you're talking about time, like what time is it or what year, then you use chronos, like chronology, okay, chronos. But kairos means like a season or a period of time. So context, the context of the work. Why was the work written? Which can become part of the interpretive triangle, or in this case, a square, I guess. So you have a person who writes a book for a particular, say you have a Jewish author who writes a book, let's say in Hebrew, or Yiddish, let's say, in Yiddish, which is German and Hebrew characters. Which tells you something about the audience that he's expecting. He's expecting an audience that's Jewish, and a certain type of Jewish audience that can read Yiddish, which would probably mean Ashkenazi Jews from Western Europe and Germany. And let's say he's writing this book in the 1940s. Well, we all kind of know what was going on with Jews in the 1940s, or at least some Jews in the 1940s. The Holocaust, or the war in Europe. The World War, of course, but especially for Jews, what was going on with Jews in Europe, with the Holocaust and the attempt to annihilate the Jewish population. So there's a context, there's a kairos then there in the story that this person wrote, which whatever it might be a short story, it might not be about the Holocaust at all. It might be a short story, a fairy tale, something, whatever. But there's a context there as well that some rhetorical critics would throw into the mix. I don't have it here, but I'm just letting you know. That does come into play when we talk about, say, the Gospels. We have the authors of the Gospels, we have the text of the Gospels, the stories about Jesus. We have the question of the audience, who were the Gospels intended to be read by, okay? Because the Gospels might be addressing certain problems in the community, and so they might highlight different stories about Jesus than other gospel writers might. But then you have the kairos, the context. What's the context in which this gospel was written? Was it a context of persecution? Was the church suffering? Was he writing to Christians who were suffering at the time? Or was it a church that was, the context of the church was mainly people who were not Jews or raised in Judaism? And so that affects what kind of stories or how the person tells the stories about Jesus, because he knows in the back of his mind that, his context is, well, I'm not a Jew, I wasn't raised a Jew, so he has different concerns about what he would like to highlight about Jesus. Okay, so that's part of the triangle and what's going on. Also, in our reading. Okay, we're heading to encounter in a second. This is also from our reading, Andrea Lunsford, in her, I don't know if I want to call it an article or a book chapter. They're really not long enough to be, maybe essay, I guess I would say. The essay that she wrote called "Writing Addresses, Invokes, and or Creates Audiences." She says, actually, I'm not going to. I kind of went over what she said already, so in other comments, I'm not going to waste your time with it. Let's get to encounter. So we're dealing with an encounter, a back and forth, a meeting, okay? An encounter. And you can see there your definition for encounter: for a particular kind of meeting or experience between persons, okay? What is it, and you could say, isn't that just a meeting? Because when we looked at meet, it's coming into the presence of another person. Yeah, but an encounter, I guess, is a particular kind of meeting. Excuse me. My nose is still runny. It's a particular kind of meeting, okay, or experience, which I'll get to in a moment. In some ways, I feel like, are we making so many distinctions that they're just distinctions without a difference, as the saying goes? Is a meeting and an encounter basically the same thing? Yeah, they kind of are. But it's a meeting of a particular kind. Okay, a meeting comes between persons. That's the essential point. But an encounter, which comes from the Anglo-French, our old friend Anglo-French, encontrer, is based on the Latin word contra, which means to be opposite something, okay, or against something, to set, to stand against the wall, contra, okay, or to sit opposite the wall, contra, okay. We use that in English when we talk about usually people's opinions. You have an opinion pro something, towards it. Okay, you're for it, or you're against it, you're contra it, it's con, okay? So an encounter is, there's an encounter. There's two people come opposite each other. There's a meeting, okay? An encounter. An experience. Hold on just 1 second, I just want to check my time. Actually, it's 5:40. So I think I've gone a little bit over the time. So that should, actually, no, I think we probably should be, just about. I've gone over just a little bit. Okay, so I'll stop here with encounter, and I'll continue on with the rest on Tuesday. So I'll just stop here for the lecture now. And thank you all. Say a little prayer for me that I start feeling better. I am, but I'm feeling a little bit better. And I hope you're all doing well, and I pray that God will bless you through his son, Jesus.